Hi, I'm Colin. I'm 15 years old and I'm restoring a Saab. Now you might remember from last episode we played a little guessing game to see if my viewers could figure out what these are, and I'll explain exactly what they are later on in the video. But the winner of last episode's game is Mr. John Fincher 496. So congratulations for being this week's winner and this episode's shout out. Hey everybody, welcome back to the first real episode of the Bumpy Road Show. And I just want to start it off by saying thank you to everybody who participated in the last video just by liking it, sharing it, or commenting, or even just viewing it. All of it really helps with my progress, and I really appreciate that. But today we're going to be doing an in-depth replacement on my ball joints today, and I want to take you guys along on that journey with me. And I have the luxury of having a service manual from the factory on how to replace them. So we're going to do a little overview on what we're going to be doing, and then I'm going to take you guys in the shop with me so that we can actually do it. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Before we start working on the ball joints, we're going to go over what the SAAB factory manual has to say about replacing them, just so we can get some official steps. Absolutely feel free to skip straight to the work, just because the manual is only for technical purposes. Now, the first page referring to the ball joints in the manual is telling us how we can check our ball joints to make sure that they're still working and they're not defective in any way. But we're going to be replacing them, so that it's not really necessary to check them. Now, the next page refers to replacing the ball joints, and that's exactly what we're looking for. The first step refers us to raising and supporting the car, and in our experience, using either a lift or jack are interchangeable and both work, and removing the road wheel. The second step tells us to place a jack under the outer end of the wishbone and raise the wishbone slightly to relieve the load on the bump stop. Now, whenever it refers to the wishbone, it means the control arm. And also it says to undo the bottom mounting on the damper, which also refers to the shock absorber. The third step says to lower the jack until the drive shaft is making contact with the edge of the aperture in the body, and it says to leave the jack in a position for a support when you remove the ball joint. Basically, the first three steps are recommending that you offload the suspension, and meanwhile there are tools to do that, exactly like we'll show in a future example. The fourth step says to undo the nut securing the ball joint to the steering swivel member and to separate the ball joint using tool 8995-409. Now, this might be fine and dandy if you have that designated SAAB tool, but some of us at home might not. So we've came up with an easy solution to get that out, and we'll show that in our live demonstration. The fifth step says to remove the ball joint from the steering swivel member, and there's a little precautionary tip that says to tie up or support the steering swivel member to prevent the brake lines from being damaged. Now, this is an absolutely crucial tip because as much as you want to be able to go, you also want to be able to stop. The sixth step tells us to fit the new ball joint to the steering swivel member and to tighten the nut, and the seventh step tells us using new lock nuts to secure the ball joint to the wishbone, also known as the control arm. Now, step 8 says using the jack, raise the control arm to the appropriate height and refit the shock absorber, and step 9 says to refit the wheel and lower the car. As you can see on the right hand side, there are some pictures depicting on how to work on this, and in the very middle of those pictures there is a beautiful diagram which perfectly shows the entire assembly of the steering swivel member and both the top and bottom ball joints. Now we move on to swapping the ball joints. Today we're going to be installing the Bison Performance suspension kit for my upper and lower ball joints that attach to my steering swivel member, just because the old ones that came with the car simply needed a change, and the kit came with the nuts, bolts, and washers that were necessary to apply it to the steering swivel member, and we're going to show you exactly how that's done. So these are industrial nuts on a bolt. These were taken from a power line. And they were converted into what we're going to be sticking into our suspension today. My dad actually made these, but what's supposed to actually be used for this is it's kind of like a Y-shaped doohickey. This is that same Y-shaped doohickey, but this is called an official SAAB suspension insert. So I have these two bolts here, and what we're going to do with them is we're going to stick them between the control arm and the unibody to allow the suspension to be able to be offloaded so that we don't crush the unibody. Here's a picture of our makeshift spacers here, which is held under the control arm and against the unibody. And the reason you want to offload your suspension before you do this job is that the entire weight of the car engine inside or not is still going to be on the suspension. Now, whenever you don't offload it, the entire weight is going to drop and it's going to hit your unibody and it's going to crush it, it's going to damage it. And the damage really quite varies depending on the weight of your car, and it could be just a catastrophic incident that you could completely avoid by offloading your suspension. After inserting our spacers, now it's time to take the lugs off the wheel so that we can take the wheel off. Now we're going to pull the wheel off. The first thing I did was I loosened the nut that connects the upper ball joint to the steering swivel member. As it was fastened on tightly, I had to use the appropriate wrench with a hammer to be able to loosen it. And after that, we decided we should release the tie rod. So now that I have this nut loose right here, I'm going to take 2 hammers and put on either side of the steering knuckle to free up the tie rod, and we're just going to hit it and release this. As you can see in this live demonstration, we used 2 sledgehammers hitting against the side of the steering knuckle, and we had the nut on the end to be able to contain the vibrations of those hits, but it didn't really work out since it fell off, but we still managed to shock the tie rod out of its place. Next thing we did after freeing the tie rod was taking the bolts out of the upper ball joint. You want to do the front bolt first and the back one last, just like you take the upper ball joint out first and the bottom one last. Since the weight of the suspension had the bolts stuck in their holes, I respectively used a ball peen hammer to free them from their slots. We later got the steering swivel member out in its entirety, just so we can better swap the bottom ball joint because of an axle issue, but we'll continue that on the next episode. Right now, we use the hammer to pop it out of its place, and it's out. And we're attaching the ball joints on the top and the bottom. And a nice trick to do it is on the top end, you can use a ratchet. For us, it's a 19mm, and it's real easy to get snug. But on the bottom, you don't have that spacing to allow the 19 to fit in there, so you have to use an open-end 19mm wrench. So since we've got the bottom lined up here, as you can see through these holes, we're going to use the tapered punch to align the front bolt. So these puts both of them in a position. And we want to go from front to the back. So let's see how we can. So before we apply the bottom part, which is the bottom ball joint, we have the space here to apply the sway bar bushing. So you just slide it in there while you line these 2 holes up as well. So right now it's on the correct side. And it seems to be all the way in. So we had to put the camera down because I was wrestling with the sway bar here, and so we managed to install it into the lower ball joint, and that allows it to stay under pressure and tension. And so now what we're doing is we're installing the upper ball joint. Now that we got the bottom in, it's time to put in the top. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try and wrestle this in here and get it on the rail. And to help us adjust it into place, we're going to use the punch. Let's see how we can work this out. So I'm using this tapered punch right here to drive the top part of this ball joint into position, and it's got a little rail that it slides into. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it into this first bolt hole right here, and we're going to use it to drive it into position. Just gotta kind of wiggle it in there. Now we get to finalize installing the ball joints. What we did was we used the tapered punch to align the bolt holes, and we put the bolts in starting from the front to the back. Next, you want to fasten down the nuts. But once you're sure you want to fasten the bolts down, you're going to have to use a torque wrench. For the bolts that go to the steering swivel member, you want to use between 35 and 50 Newton meters, which translates into 26 to 37 foot-pounds. And for the bolts that go into the control arm, you want to use about 40 to 55 Newton meters, which is also about 30 to 41 foot-pounds. Once you fasten down the bolts and secure the nuts, that would also finalize the ball joint swap. To finalize this little project, we're going to be putting the tie rod back onto the steering swivel member, and both of them have the freedom to move around with each other a little bit, so it can be really easy to align them. After you put the tie rod into the steering swivel member, you want to fasten it down with a nut until you're sure that you're ready to torque it, which you can use these specifications to do so. And we have just done a swap. Now, we might have completed the swap, but I implore you guys who have been following along today to double check your work just to make sure that all of your torques are correct, your nuts and bolts are fastened correctly, and given the right specification that I've given you today. I know they're from the book, so these are solid numbers, and this is what SAAB requests you to do in their service guide. Remember, sacrificing a few minutes now could save you a long time in the long run. And you might not be able to see much from this angle, but this is the hint to the next episode, and I'm wondering if you guys can guess this one in the comments. I'll be seriously surprised if anybody can, and I'll make sure to shout you out in the next video.